It all started on an ordinary flight from Atlanta to Chicago. The cabin bustled with people finding their seats, placing bags in the overhead compartments, and adjusting themselves for the trip. Among the passengers was Millie Cohen, a woman in her late 40s, dressed in an expensive but garish blouse with oversized sunglasses perched on her head. She walked down the aisle with an air of entitlement, glancing around as if she owned the plane. Behind her, a well-built man with a calm demeanor and a neatly pressed uniform took his place in line. His name was Officer Malik Johnson, a respected cop known for his cool-headedness and dedication to serving his community. He didn't look like the kind of man to seek out confrontation, and judging by the quiet confidence he carried, he certainly didn't need to. But Millie didn't see him that way. To her, he was just another inconvenience, a barrier in her path. As Millie reached her row, she noticed with visible disdain that Officer Johnson was seated right next to her. Her eyes narrowed, lips curling in distaste, but she kept her thoughts to herself for now. Malik, meanwhile, simply smiled politely and moved aside so she could get to her seat by the window. She didn't bother to acknowledge him, muttering something under her breath about respecting personal space. Malik caught her words but said nothing, deciding it wasn't worth engaging. As the flight took off and the seatbelt sign turned off, Millie's discontent grew louder. She made passive-aggressive comments under her breath about people who didn't belong in certain spaces and threw occasional glares Malik's way. Passengers around them exchanged glances, sensing the tension brewing between the two. Malik did his best to ignore her, choosing instead to focus on the book in his hands. But it wasn't long before Millie's whispered insults turned into an outright confrontation in a loud voice that cut through the cabin noise. She sneered, "I don't understand why some people can't just stay in their own lane. Don't you think that's appropriate?" Malik looked up, surprised by her brazen attitude. Trying to defuse the situation, he simply replied, "I'm just here for the flight, same as you." "Oh, is that right?" she scoffed. "People like you think you can just go anywhere, do anything, and take up space like you belong here." Her words stung, not just for their blatant disrespect, but for the way she said them with a superiority that made his stomach churn. Malik stayed calm, choosing not to escalate, but Millie wasn't done. She leaned closer, sneering as if he were beneath her. "Tell me, officer, is this the first time you've been on a flight? Do you even know how to behave around them?" Passengers were starting to turn and watch, some whispered in disbelief, others shook their heads, while a few seemed downright embarrassed. Malik felt the eyes of the passengers on him, wondering if he'd respond to her going. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied evenly, doing his best to ignore her venom. "I'm just here for a peaceful flight." She rolled her eyes dramatically. "Peaceful? Oh, please. I've seen people like you cause all sorts of trouble. I bet the second something goes wrong on this plane, you'd be the first to blame everyone else, right?" Malik clenched his jaw, trying to keep his temper in check. He knew that arguing with someone so determined to provoke him would only lead to more trouble, but Millie wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "You think that uniform means anything? I bet they just hand those out to anyone these days." Her voice dripped with contempt as she sneered. "I don't feel safe sitting next to you. You look like you could get violent any second now." At this, Malik took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He'd been trained to handle situations far more intense than this, but something about the way she looked at him, the dismissive way she treated him as if he were beneath her, nodded him. He began slowly, his voice measured, "I'm here just like anyone else, and just like you, I'd like a peaceful trip." Millie laughed, her voice cold and mocking. "A peaceful trip? Oh, please. I'm sure everyone here knows what you're really like. It's always the same story, pretending to be something you're not just so you can slip in where you're not wanted." Her words were sharp and filled with contempt, resonating throughout the cabin. A few passengers looked at Malik with sympathy, recognizing the racism laced within her words. Others seemed uncomfortable, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Malik, however, maintained his composure, deciding that he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. After a while, Millie grew even bolder, pushing her seat back so forcefully that it nearly knocked over Malik's water bottle on the tray table. She turned to him, giving him a fake smile. "Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't see you there." Malik nodded politely. "It's fine, "Oh, how kind," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I didn't expect someone like you to be so civil." The mocking tone in her voice was undeniable, but Malik simply adjusted his posture, refusing to give in to her bait. Despite his calm exterior, inside he felt the tension building. Years on the job had taught him patience and given him the strength to rise above, but this was a test unlike any other. As the flight attendant passed by, she caught the tension in Millie's words and offered Malik a sympathetic glance. But Millie noticed and shot the attendant a withering look. "Is there something funny about all this?" she demanded. The attendant quickly shook her head and moved on. Millie continued her tirade, whispering insults and occasionally throwing cutting remarks Malik's way, fully aware that other passengers could hear. The people around them exchanged glances, visibly uncomfortable with the situation but unsure how to intervene. The atmosphere grew tense as Malik quietly took in her words, allowing her to think she had won some invisible battle. Little did she know that karma was already on its way and that every bitter word she threw at him would only come back to haunt her. As the flight carried on, Millie seemed to grow bolder with every passing minute. Perhaps the lack of intervention from other passengers fueled her confidence, or maybe she was just testing how far she could push Malik before he would respond. But Malik remained steadfast, his calm presence seemingly impervious to her escalating provocations. The plane's cabin lights dimmed as the crew prepared for the beverage service, and the low hum of the engine filled the silence that followed Millie's latest jab. Malik had decided to focus on his book once again, hoping that eventually she would run out of steam. But Millie wasn't ready to back down. "Excuse me," she snapped at the flight attendant as they approached. The young woman, trying to maintain a polite smile, leaned in to take her order. Millie tilted her head, making a show of looking around Malik as though he were nothing more than an obstacle in her way. "Could you bring me some sparkling water and make sure it's cold?" "None of that room temperature nonsense. Some of us have standards." The flight attendant nodded, keeping her expression neutral as she jotted down Millie's order, then turned to Malik with a warm smile. "And for you, sir, just water, please." Malik responded politely, ignoring Millie's side eye as the flight attendant moved on. Millie let out an exaggerated sigh. "Well, at least someone around here has some manners," she muttered loud enough for Malik to hear. He chose to let it slide. Experience had taught him the power of silence in situations like these. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words ever could. But Millie was clearly undeterred. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned with their drinks, handing Malik his cup of water first. Millie's eyes flashed with irritation as she watched him receive his drink before hers. "Excuse me, shouldn't I be served first?" she demanded, narrowing her eyes at the attendant. The flight attendant, visibly flustered, handed Millie her drink and quickly moved on, likely eager to escape the growing tension. Millie took a delicate sip, savoring her supposed victory, while Malik took a calming breath, mentally reminding himself to stay patient. But the peace wouldn't last. Millie suddenly leaned into Malik's space, her voice a stage whisper for everyone to hear. "You know," she began, feigning a casual tone, "I've never had to sit so close to someone who clearly doesn't appreciate a little class." Malik glanced at her, trying to understand her angle. "I'm just here for a peaceful flight," he replied calmly as he had before. "Oh, peaceful?" She raised her eyebrows mockingly. "I don't know if someone like you really understands that word. From what I've seen on the news, people like you usually thrive in chaos, don't you?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the passengers seated nearby, their body language showing unease as they pretended not to overhear. But Millie wasn't deterred by the discomfort she caused. In fact, she seemed to thrive on it, her smug smile growing as she relished the tension she'd created. Malik decided that ignoring her entirely was now his best option. He turned back to his book, not giving her the satisfaction of a response. But Millie wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. She leaned even closer, her voice dripping with contempt as she smeared, "People like you should know their place. You'd think a uniform would teach you that, wouldn't you?" In that moment, Malik's grip on his book tightened, but he remained composed. He'd spent years on the force dealing with hostile suspects, heated arguments, and tense confrontations. If he could manage those, he could certainly handle Millie's jabs. Yet it took every ounce of his restraint not to give her a piece of his mind. Just then, a little boy seated across the aisle pointed at Malik, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Mommy," the child whispered, "is he a police officer?" The mother shushed her son gently, but Malik caught her eye and gave the boy a reassuring smile. "Yes, I am," Malik said warmly, his tone softening as he addressed the boy. "I help people stay safe." The mother smiled back, appreciative of his kindness, but Millie couldn't stand this small moment of respect Malik received. She let out a loud scoff and snickered, "Well, I don't feel safe with you here, that's for sure." The mother looked at Millie, clearly taken aback by her hostility, while the boy watched in confusion. Malik felt his heart ache slightly, not for himself, but for the young child who had to witness such unnecessary hatred. "Why don't you move then?" Malik said finally, his voice calm but edged with firmness. "There are open seats in the back if this one bothers you so much." The suggestion hit Millie like a slap. She straightened in her seat, her face contorting with indignation. "Move? Are you suggesting that I move?" She practically spat the words, her tone dripping with disdain. "I paid for this seat. I have every right to be here, just as much as anyone." Malik simply nodded. "Then I suggest we respect each other's space," he replied calmly. "Let's keep this flight civil." But Millie wasn't ready to let go. Her anger festered, building into an unmistakable rage. Her voice rose once again, this time louder, drawing the attention of even more passengers. "You think you can tell me what to do?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "How dare you? I don't need some nobody cop telling me how to behave." By now, several passengers had turned to look, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Malik took a deep breath, maintaining his poise. Though the intense focus of so many people made his pulse quicken, a flight attendant had appeared from the front of the plane, alerted by the disturbance. She approached cautiously, her expression tense as she assessed the situation. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her eyes shifting between Millie and Malik. "Yes, everything's fine," Malik replied calmly, hoping to de-escalate the scene. "Everything is not fine," Millie interrupted sharply. "This man has been nothing but rude to me since the moment I boarded. I demand that you do something about it." The flight attendant looked at Millie, clearly puzzled by her outburst, and then at Malik, who seemed calm and collected despite the woman's accusations. Malik could tell the attendant wasn't buying Millie's story, but she nodded politely nonetheless. "I'll speak to the captain about the situation," she said before walking back to the front. Millie sat back in her seat, her expression smug as if she had just won some imaginary victory. Malik glanced at her, unshaken, but he couldn't help but wonder how far she was willing to push things and if her sense of entitlement would lead her to make an even bigger scene before the flight was over. As the plane continued its journey, Malik settled back in his seat, doing his best to ignore Millie's presence. His patience had seen him through far worse encounters, and he reminded himself that he could make it through a few more hours in the air. However, Millie seemed determined to keep him on edge. She shuffled in her seat repeatedly, brushing her elbow into his, making it clear she wasn't content with leaving him in peace. Malik stared out of the window, watching clouds drift lazily below them. He could feel Millie's gaze boring into the side of his face, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. He knew that if he responded, it would only fuel her behavior further. "People like you really don't belong in spaces like this," she sneered. "You know, honestly, they should make a different section for people like you." Malik's jaw tightened. Her persistence in antagonizing him was becoming more brazen with every passing minute, yet he continued to keep his calm. He reminded himself of the professionalism drilled into him during his years of training as a police officer. He knew all too well the power of restraint and patience, but Millie didn't stop. A few rows ahead, a man glanced back, his brows knitted in concern. He had clearly overheard enough of Millie's comments to sense the hostility in her words. Malik gave him a quick reassuring nod, signaling that he had the situation under control. The man hesitated but returned to his book, though he kept casting cautious glances over his shoulder. The minutes dragged on as Millie's whispering persisted. She occasionally chuckled to herself as though reveling in her own humor. Finally, she leaned closer, her voice laced with mockery. "Let me guess, you're just trying to look like you belong, right? Bet you put on that uniform just to make people take you seriously." This time, Malik couldn't help himself. He looked at her, his calm eyes meeting her smug gaze. "I wear my uniform to serve and protect all people," he replied quietly, his voice unwavering. "It's not a costume." "Oh, really?" she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "I'm sure that's what they all say." She muttered something under her breath, something Malik couldn't fully make out, but he caught enough to understand it was yet another insult. The young mother from across the aisle shook her head in disapproval, her brow furrowing as she held her child close. Another flight attendant had noticed the rising tension and stepped forward, concerned but cautious. "Is there an issue here?" the attendant asked, her tone polite but firm. Millie looked up, faking surprise. "Oh no, not at all," she replied with a sweet smile, putting on an act that bordered on theatrical. "I was just making some small talk with this officer here, isn't that right?" Malik kept his face neutral, giving a curt nod. He could see the concern in the flight attendant's eyes, but he wanted to avoid escalating the situation any further. However, Millie wasn't finished. "Now that I think about it, I do feel rather uncomfortable," she continued, addressing the flight attendant. "I don't think it's right that I'm being forced to sit next to someone who's obviously trying to intimidate me." The flight attendant's eyebrows lifted in surprise, clearly taken aback by Millie's accusation. "Intimidate you, This officer has been sitting quietly since the beginning of the flight," she said, glancing at Malik for confirmation. Millie's face twisted in indignation. "Excuse me? Are you saying you don't believe me?" she snapped, her tone rising. Her voice had now drawn the attention of several more passengers who watched the exchange with growing unease. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable, glancing between Malik and Millie, unsure of how to proceed. Malik simply gave a reassuring smile, doing his best to defuse the situation. "Everything's fine," he said calmly. "There's no need to worry." But Millie, sensing that she was losing control of the narrative, raised her voice further. "No, there is a need to worry. I've never been treated this way before. I want to speak to the captain." The other passengers exchanged bewildered glances, clearly puzzled by her sudden outburst. Malik felt the tension in the cabin rising, a collective discomfort settling over the group. He glanced at the flight attendant, who was trying her best to maintain her composure in the face of Millie's theatrics. "I'm sorry," the attendant replied diplomatically. "The captain is currently occupied with managing the flight. I assure you there's nothing to be concerned about." Millie scoffed, folding her arms defiantly. "Well, I find that hard to believe," she muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. She shot Malik a glare before looking away, her expression hotly as though she were somehow victorious. The flight continued in strained silence for several minutes, Millie seething quietly in her seat. Malik took a steadying breath, reminding himself once again to remain calm. He knew he couldn't control Millie's behavior, but he could control his response to it. A couple of rows back, an elderly man leaned forward, addressing Malik with a warm smile. "I just want to thank you, officer, for what you do," he said in a soft voice, loud enough to be heard but gentle enough to avoid drawing attention from Millie. "It's a tough job," Malik nodded gratefully, appreciating the man's kind words despite the uncomfortable situation. Moments like these reminded him why he'd chosen to serve. He returned his attention to his book, determined to ignore Millie's presence, but she wasn't quite finished. Suddenly, Millie leaned over, her voice a sneer. "I don't know what that old man is thanking you for. It's not like you're really doing anything useful." Malik clenched his jaw but stayed silent. He knew better than to let her get under his skin. She thrived on his reaction, and the more he resisted, the more it frustrated her. The flight attendant returned to check on them once more, her eyes darting nervously between Malik and Millie. "Is there anything I can get either of you?" she asked, her tone tense. "I'd like to be moved," Millie said curtly, folding her arms and turning away from Malik. "I can't believe I'm being forced to sit next to someone who's so unprofessional," she continued. The attendant glanced around, but the plane was fully booked with no seats available to spare. She shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, but there are no open seats left. We're completely full today." Millie rolled her eyes, letting out an exasperated sigh. "Of course, typical," she muttered. She shifted in her seat, her irritation palpable as she glared at Malik, who continued to ignore her presence as the flight dragged on. Millie seemed to run out of steam, her taunts becoming less frequent though no less pointed. Malik maintained his silence, knowing that he was getting closer to his destination and that soon he would be free from her relentless antagonism. But something in Millie's eyes hinted that she wasn't quite finished yet. Malik could sense that she was holding on to something, an unspoken plan lingering beneath her faux calm. As he leaned back in his seat, he prepared himself, knowing that whatever she had planned next, he'd be ready. As the flight wore on, the other passengers had begun whispering among themselves, quietly discussing Millie's ongoing antagonism. People were shifting uncomfortably, glancing at Malik with sympathy or nodding in acknowledgement of his patience. The tension in the cabin was nearly tangible, and Malik could feel the weight of their eyes on him, quietly urging him to respond in some way. Yet he remained composed, letting Millie's words roll off him like water off a stone. But Millie wasn't giving up. Her dissatisfaction with the lack of reaction had her fidgeting in her seat, and it was evident she was determined to push until she got the response she craved. Then suddenly, Millie sat up straighter in her seat and pressed the call button above her head with a sharp jab of her finger. The flight attendant from earlier returned, her face tight with stress. "Yes?" she asked, her voice polite but wary, clearly prepared for more complaints. Millie fixed her with a steely look. "I want to lodge an official complaint," she declared, loud enough for those around her to hear. "This officer has made my entire flight a nightmare. I am a paying customer, and I demand that someone addresses this immediately." The flight attendant blinked in surprise, her eyes darting over to Malik, who was still seated calmly, his face showing no signs of distress or anger. Malik didn't respond, instead choosing to maintain his silence and let the scene play out. The attendant replied carefully, "Officer Blake has not done anything wrong. I've observed him, and he's been sitting quietly for the duration of the flight." Millie scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "So you're saying it's fine for me to feel unsafe and uncomfortable? I mean, look at him." She pointed at Malik, her finger shaking with exaggerated indignation. "I deserve to feel safe in my seat, and this man is threatening my peace." Malik's patience was waning, but he still held his tongue, determined not to give her the reaction she was aiming for. He simply met her gaze with a steady look, showing her that her words did not intimidate him. He could see the other passengers looking on with a mixture of irritation and pity for him in their eyes. The flight attendant sighed, visibly grappling with frustration but maintaining her composure. "I assure you, Officer Blake has not threatened or harmed anyone on this plane. Now, if you'd like a beverage or some assistance with anything else, I'd be happy to help you." Millie's face twisted with anger, clearly dissatisfied with the attendant's response. She threw herself back into her seat, muttering loud enough for those nearby to hear, "This is absolutely outrageous, a paying customer treated like this. It's unbelievable." Several rows ahead, an older woman wearing a colorful scarf leaned back and addressed the flight attendant. "If you don't mind, can you bring some water for this fine officer here? He's doing a great job handling all this nonsense," she said, her voice loud and clear. The surrounding passengers murmured in agreement, some nodding and giving Malik encouraging smiles. The support from strangers gave Malik a small sense of relief, a reminder that not everyone shared Millie's narrow-minded perspective. Millie looked around, her cheeks red with indignation as she realized that others were turning against her. She crossed her arms, visibly seething, but she seemed to sense that her plan wasn't working the way she had hoped. Malik could feel her frustration radiating from her as she glared at him, but he kept his focus on the distant hum of the engines, grounding himself in their steady rhythm. About an hour later, just as Malik began to think Millie might be done with her harassment, she suddenly reached across him, her hand brushing his arm as she leaned to grab a magazine from the seat pocket in front of him. She did it with deliberate intent, making sure her fingers touched his arm longer than necessary as if to assert some silent, hostile claim over the space. "Excuse me," Malik said, his voice level, "please respect my personal space." She pulled her hand back, giving him a mocking smile. "Oh, I'm sorry, officer. Didn't realize you were so sensitive." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably at her comment, glancing away as the tension thickened. But Malik remained silent, knowing that any response would only fuel her fire. He reminded himself that he dealt with far worse situations in his career, though this was certainly testing his limits. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would begin their descent shortly. A ripple of relief swept through the cabin as passengers started to prepare for landing, adjusting their seats and stowing away loose items. Malik took a deep breath, grateful that the flight was almost over and that he'd soon be able to leave Millie's toxic energy behind him. But Millie had one final move left. As the plane descended, she leaned closer to him, her voice a sharp whisper filled with malice. "You might think you can just ignore me, but people like you don't belong here," she hissed, her words dripping with venom. "You're just a uniform trying to fit in, and once we're off this plane, you're nothing." Malik didn't flinch, meeting her gaze with quiet resolve. He was done trying to ignore her, but he refused to let her win. He knew he represented more than just himself, and he wouldn't stoop to her level. He simply held her gaze unyielding and let her words fall into silence. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels skidding briefly on the runway before steadying. A wave of relief washed over Malik as they taxied toward the gate. Though he knew that Millie's hostility would not simply dissipate as soon as they disembarked, he remained calm, knowing that he had maintained his integrity through her endless provocations. The flight attendants offered him apologetic glances as he passed by, clearly uncomfortable with the ordeal he'd endured yet grateful for the patience he had shown. He nodded to them, accepting their silent gestures of support, and made his way toward the exit. However, Malik's instincts told him that his interaction with Millie wasn't quite over yet. There was something in her demeanor, a sense of unfinished business that told him she might try something more outside the plane. But he pushed the thought aside for now, focusing instead on making his way through the terminal and to his next destination. As he exited the plane and stepped into the bustling airport, he prepared himself for whatever else the day might throw his way. Millie might have tested his patience, but he knew he was stronger than her taunts, stronger than the prejudice she carried so openly. Malik glanced around, checking his watch as he navigated through the terminal. He thought about calling his family just to ground himself after the stressful flight. But as he glanced over his shoulder, he caught a glimpse of Millie in the distance, her expression hard and determined as she made her way toward the baggage claim. It seemed their encounter was far from over. After Malik exited the plane, he blended into the bustling flow of passengers, navigating his way through the busy airport. The fluorescent lights overhead and the clinking of luggage wheels against the polished floor created an odd sense of calm after the tense atmosphere on the plane. Yet Malik sensed something stirring. He couldn't shake the feeling that Millie wasn't done with her harassment. Even as he tried to push her out of his mind, as he passed through the terminal, Malik kept his pace steady, focused on the goal of retrieving his luggage and moving on from the entire ordeal. He scanned the baggage claim area, which was teeming with travelers, and stepped back slightly to keep a low profile, allowing the crowd to fill in ahead of him. Just as he was about to pick up his phone to check in with his family, he felt eyes on him. Then he saw her, Millie. There she was, about 20 feet away, standing at the edge of the crowd with a look of fierce determination. She was watching him, her eyes cold and calculating as if she was sizing him up for yet another confrontation. Malik's instinct was to ignore her and avoid another escalation, but he knew he'd have to stay alert just in case she decided to stir things up again. After a brief stare down, Millie began moving through the crowd, angling her way toward him with an unsettling sense of purpose. She moved briskly, her heels clicking against the floor with each deliberate step, her lips pressed into a thin line of disdain. Malik watched her approach, steeling himself for whatever was coming next, his face calm but his muscles tense. "Excuse me, Malik," Millie called out loudly as she closed the gap between them, catching the attention of nearby travelers. She raised her voice, making a show of pointing at Malik as though he'd committed some grave offense. "I need security here right now." Passengers around them exchanged puzzled looks, some even muttering under their breaths as they watched Millie's antics. A security guard who had been overseeing the area took notice of the commotion and quickly approached them, his expression wary. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, glancing between Millie and Malik with a look of concern. Millie turned her best scowl on the guard, her voice dripping with entitlement. "This man has been harassing me ever since we boarded the plane. I need him removed from this area immediately," she declared, waving her hands wildly as if to emphasize her point. The guard, taken aback, looked at Malik with uncertainty. Malik met his gaze calmly, his expression open and honest. He knew he had nothing to hide and that Millie's accusations held no ground, but he understood how serious this could look to someone unaware of the full story. He took a deep breath and prepared himself to respond, carefully considering his words. "Sir, do you have anything to say about this?" the guard asked, clearly uncomfortable with the tension between them. Malik nodded. "Yes, I do," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm Officer Blake with the local police department. I haven't spoken a word to this woman outside of politely asking her to respect my space on the plane. I don't know what her problem is, but I assure you I haven't harassed her in any way." The guard's eyes widened slightly as he took in Malik's words, clearly caught off guard by the revelation. Millie, however, seemed unfazed. Her face twisted into a look of scorn as she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in Malik's direction. "Oh please," she sneered. "You really think anyone's going to believe that? Just because you have a badge doesn't mean you're above everyone else." The guard's eyes flickered between them, his unease apparent. "I understand you're upset, but let's keep this civil," he said, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Millie wasn't interested in civility. Her voice grew louder as she continued her tirade, oblivious to the crowd of onlookers who had begun to gather around them, some watching with curiosity, others with evident disapproval. "This is exactly what's wrong with people like him," she shouted, her voice rising above the low hum of the crowd. "They think they can walk around acting however they want, pushing their way into places they don't belong." The guard's expression shifted, a mixture of confusion and discomfort crossing his face as he tried to process the scene unfolding before him. He turned to Malik, clearly seeking some form of guidance or confirmation about what to do next. But Malik remained calm, his gaze unwavering as he addressed the guard once more. "Look, I'm not here to cause any trouble. I just want to get my bags and leave. Whatever issue this woman has is her own to deal with, not mine," he said firmly. Millie glared at him, her face contorting in anger as her plan seemed to unravel. She glanced around at the onlookers, clearly hoping for some form of support, but the faces staring back at her were filled with judgment and disbelief. The tide of the crowd was shifting, and Millie was beginning to realize it. Just then, a woman stepped forward from the crowd, an elderly lady with a kind face and a resolute expression. "Young man," she addressed the guard, "I was on that flight. This officer didn't do a single thing to that woman. She's been harassing him non-stop. It's a disgrace." A murmur of agreement rippled through the surrounding passengers as others began to speak up, some even recounting the events they'd witnessed on the plane. Millie's face grew redder with each word spoken against her, her confidence visibly faltering as she realized she was losing the support she desperately tried to rally. The guard, now armed with the accounts of multiple witnesses, turned back to Millie, his expression stern. "It sounds like you've been causing a disturbance," he said, his tone firm. "I suggest you take a moment to compose yourself." Millie's mouth opened and closed as though she was struggling to form a coherent response, but before she could speak, Malik took a small step forward, his gaze steady as he addressed her directly for the first time since they'd left the plane. "Millie," he said quietly, his voice calm yet carrying an undeniable weight, "you can stop this now or you can keep digging yourself deeper. Either way, I'm not going to let your behavior affect me." For a brief moment, Millie seemed to waver, her bravado cracking under the weight of Malik's steady resolve, but then, just as quickly, her expression hardened and she scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder with a dismissive sneer. "Oh, I'll be seeing you again, officer," she said with a low, venomous tone. Don't you worry about that. With one final scathing look, Millie turned on her heel and stormed away, disappearing into the throngs of travelers moving through the terminal. The crowd gradually dispersed, some offering Malik supportive nods or quiet words of encouragement as they went on their way. Malik felt a surge of relief as the tension dissipated, but he knew this encounter wasn't entirely over. Millie's parting words lingered in his mind, a reminder that her hatred was far from extinguished. He watched the crowd thinning out around him, feeling a renewed sense of calm wash over him as he prepared to collect his belongings and head toward the exit. The situation might have escalated on the plane and at baggage claim, but he knew he had handled himself with integrity. As Malik made his way to the airport exit, a chill washed over him that felt long overdue. The initial tension from Millie's confrontations on the plane and at the baggage claim had drained him, but the supportive words from fellow passengers reassured him that he'd handled everything with composure. He was looking forward to getting home, shutting the door behind him, and putting this entire ordeal in the past. But just as he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp evening air, he spotted a sleek dark SUV parked near the curb, a man dressed in a suit leaning casually against the driver's side. Something about his stance caught Malik's attention. The man's eyes locked onto Malik as he approached, and Malik's instincts kicked in, noting the man's polished demeanor and the discreet earpiece tucked into his ear. "Officer Blake," the man asked, stepping forward with a polite but firm nod. "I'm Richard Nevin, Private Security." Malik's brows furrowed, unsure of what this could be about. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Nevin offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I believe you've had a bit of an encounter with one of our clients, Mrs. Millie Cohen. She called our firm and requested assistance." Malik's stomach twisted slightly at the mention of Millie's name. This was taking an unexpected turn. He crossed his arms, his expression calm but wary. "She asked for private security," he repeated, not entirely sure if he found the situation concerning or just strange. "Yes," Nevin confirmed, his expression carefully neutral. "Apparently, she's under the impression that she might need protection." Malik couldn't help but raise an eyebrow, almost amused at the audacity. Protection from what exactly? Nevin's professional facade wavered just a little, as if he were also grappling with the absurdity of the situation. "Well, that's the thing, officer. She didn't give us any concrete details. She simply claimed that you posed a potential threat to her safety." Malik held back a sigh, nodding slowly as he pieced together Millie's twisted plan. It was clear she was trying to paint him as some sort of aggressor, manipulating her resources to turn herself into the victim. The irony wasn't lost on him, and he could see the barely concealed exasperation on Nevin's face as well. "Well, Mr. Nevin," Malik said, his tone firm, "I assure you she has no reason to feel threatened by me, but I appreciate you coming here to talk to me directly." Nevin nodded, as though he'd expected this answer. "Understood, Officer Blake. To be honest, this isn't the first unusual request she's made with us, and we wanted to address the situation thoroughly." Malik watched as Eni pulled out a small business card, offering it with a nod. "If anything changes, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're required to follow through with our client requests, even the unusual ones." Malik accepted the card, glancing at it before tucking it into his pocket. "I appreciate it, Mr. Nevin, and I understand you're just doing your job," he said with a nod of mutual understanding. Nevin returned to his vehicle, driving away into the evening traffic. Malik stood there for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The situation had taken on a surreal quality, as though he were stuck in a nightmare he couldn't escape from. He knew Millie wouldn't be content to let things rest, but having her hire a private security firm to monitor him was beyond absurd. Deciding it was best to get home, Malik walked toward the taxi line, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that Millie was up to something bigger than her initial outburst, and he had a suspicion that things would get worse before they got better. Still, he was determined not to let her antics disrupt his life. Once inside the taxi, he leaned back against the seat, the low hum of the engine easing some of his tension. The city lights blurred past the window, and for a moment, Malik allowed himself to think beyond the day's frustrations, imagining the peaceful evening he hoped to have. He'd finally have a chance to relax, maybe enjoy a quiet dinner, and let the stress of the day wash away. But as the taxi neared his neighborhood, Malik's phone buzzed. He glanced down, feeling a surge of irritation as Millie's name flashed on the screen. His grip on the phone tightened, but he quickly composed himself, reminding himself not to let her rattle him. Still, curiosity got the better of him, and he answered. "Officer Blake," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "are you having a good evening?" Malik kept his response short. "What do you want, Millie?" She laughed, a sound that sent an icy chill down his spine. "Oh, just checking in. You know, it's a shame people like you get to wear a badge. Makes people feel unsafe." Malik took a steadying breath, refusing to let her bait him. "Is there something specific you'd like to say, Millie?" "Because I'm done with this conversation," she replied, her tone smug. "But I'll save it for when we meet again. And believe me, we will." With that, she hung up, leaving Malik staring at his phone, a mix of anger and frustration swirling in his mind. He couldn't understand why Millie was so fixated on him, and the sinister tone in her voice unsettled him more than he cared to admit. When he finally arrived home, Malik took a deep breath, willing himself to let go of the tension that had followed him from the plane to his doorstep. As he opened his front door, the familiar comfort of his home provided some solace, though Millie's words lingered in his mind like a dark cloud. He moved through his evening routine, trying to distract himself, but he knew he'd need to address Millie's behavior more formally. While he hadn't wanted to escalate things, her recent actions were edging toward harassment, and he could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. The next morning, after a restless night, Malik made his way to his precinct. He filled out a brief report outlining the encounter, detailing Millie's repeated attempts to antagonize him both on the plane and afterward. It was a simple enough process, but it felt strange to put her actions into words, as if admitting that the absurdity of the situation had escalated into something more serious. His supervisor reviewed the report with a frown, nodding thoughtfully. "You did the right thing," he said finally, his tone reassuring. "This kind of harassment is unacceptable, regardless of the circumstances. If she contacts you again, keep us informed, we'll handle it." Malik felt a weight lift from his shoulders at his supervisor's support, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Millie wasn't finished yet. He hoped the formal complaint would serve as a deterrent, but a part of him knew she wouldn't be easy to silence. Later that day, as Malik returned home, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, scanning his surroundings with a sense of unease. Paranoia wasn't something he was used to feeling, but Millie's relentless behavior had wormed its way under his skin, leaving him on edge. As he settled into his evening, Malik tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself that he'd taken the necessary steps to address the situation. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind warned him that this wasn't over and he'd have to stay vigilant. As the days passed, Malik stayed alert, waiting for any sign that Millie might resurface. He kept his schedule light and his attention sharp, unwilling to let her catch him off guard. Her last words had stayed with him, "Believe me, we will meet again." Despite the chilling tone of that threat, Malik wasn't one to live in fear, and he certainly wouldn't give Millie the satisfaction of unnerving him. But 2 weeks later, Malik found himself face to face with her in the most unexpected way. It was late in the evening, and he'd been assigned to assist with a local charity event where several off-duty officers were volunteering. The event was a high-profile gala attended by prominent community members, meant to raise funds for youth programs, and Malik was there to provide security. He had just started his shift when, in a moment of bad luck, or destiny, he caught sight of Millie. She was mingling with guests near the front of the room, her head thrown back in laughter as she clinked glasses with a small group of people. Malik's instinct told him to ignore her and focus on his work, but Millie spotted him before he could turn away. Her expression shifted from surprise to satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting for this very moment. With a sly grin, she excused herself from her group and made her way over to him, each step tripping with purpose. "Well, look who decided to crash a classy event," she sneered, her voice just low enough for him to hear. Malik's expression remained calm, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. "I'm here as part of my job, Millie. Just like you're here." Pretending to have class, her cheeks flushed red at the insult, but she quickly covered it with a mocking laugh. Job, I suppose that's what you'd call it, being paid to lurk around like a second-rate security guard. I almost didn't recognize you in that suit, clearly borrowed, I imagine. Malik's patience was wearing thin, but he reminded himself to stay professional. He had no intention of causing a scene, especially at an event meant to bring the community together. Millie, I'm here to make sure everyone is safe, including you, he replied calmly. But I'd suggest you enjoy your evening without starting trouble. Her eyes gleamed mischief mingling with malice. Trouble? I'm not the one causing trouble, Officer Blake, she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Maybe you just need to learn to handle yourself better. Malik clenched his jaw, maintaining his composure. He knew anything he said would only feed her need for confrontation, so he took a step back, indicating the conversation was over. He barely turned to walk away when he heard her voice again, sharper and louder than before. Oh, come on, officer, she called out, her voice carrying through the room. Heads began to turn, guests looking over with interest, some even moving closer to see what was happening. Are you really going to just walk away like a coward? Isn't that against your so-called code? Malik turned back slowly, unwilling to let her continue making a scene, but equally aware of the dozens of eyes now trained on them. He took a steadying breath. This isn't the time, Millie, he replied evenly. I'm asking you to let it go. But Millie wasn't backing down. She raised her voice, addressing the crowd. Now, isn't it incredible, ladies and gentlemen, she sneered, gesturing toward Malik, we pay these people to protect us, yet here he is, lurking around just waiting to make a move on me. It's frightening, really. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, murmuring as Millie's words echoed around the room. Malik could see the confusion and doubt flickering across the guests' faces, some even beginning to nod along with her accusation. His hands tightened at his sides, frustration boiling over as she continued to twist the narrative, painting herself as a victim in a drama she'd single-handedly created. But just as she was ramping up her tirade, a familiar face emerged from the crowd, his supervisor, Lieutenant Carrington, who had come to the event as an invited guest. Carrington's eyes met Malik's with a knowing look, and he stepped forward, calmly addressing Millie. Excuse me, Carrington said, his tone professional yet authoritative. Is there an issue here? Millie's bravado faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, shifting into a feigned look of distress. Yes, there is, officer, she spat the word like it was a curse. He has been harassing me all evening. I feel completely unsafe with him here. Carrington raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting from Millie to Malik, who gave a silent nod of affirmation. I see. And you're certain about this? He asked Millie, his tone leaving little room for embellishment. Absolutely, she said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. Carrington regarded her for a moment, then calmly stated, well, if you truly feel unsafe, we have two options, either I can escort you from the premises myself, or you're welcome to file an official complaint with our department. He glanced around, noting the crowd's interest in the confrontation. But I would suggest we resolve this discreetly so as not to disrupt the event. Millie's face reddened, clearly unprepared for such a direct response. She opened her mouth, searching for a retort, but no words came. The crowd had fallen silent, watching as her accusations deflated in the face of calm authority. Malik's relief was palpable. Carrington's steady presence had diffused Millie's attempt to publicly humiliate him, and he silently thanked his supervisor for stepping in. When he did, Carrington's gaze met his, and he gave a slight nod, a signal that the matter was closed. The rest of the evening passed quietly, with Millie retreating into the shadows, fuming but defeated. Malik went about his duties, feeling the weight of her harassment finally lifting, replaced by the warmth of his colleague's support. But the moment he least expected it, she reappeared, her voice low but filled with venom. You think you've won tonight, Officer Blake, she hissed. But see to it that your career is over. Just wait, she stormed off, leaving Malik shaking his head, exasperated but not shaken. She'd gone too far already, and he was ready to take any steps necessary to protect his reputation and career from her unfounded threats. The gala concluded without further incident, but But as Malik walked to his car later that night, he knew Millie wasn't done yet. Her fixation was growing more dangerous, and her threats were becoming less empty with each encounter. He realized that sooner or later he'd have to confront her behavior head-on, ensuring it didn't escalate further. The days that followed the gala left Malik on edge, but he was determined to let his focus remain on his work, his family, and his peace of mind. His patience was stretched thin by Millie's last warning at the gala, but he had no intention of letting her threats dictate his life. If she resurfaced, he'd handle it professionally and by the book. He believed his record and reputation would stand on their own, no matter what she tried to throw his way. It was about a week later when Malik was called into the precinct to cover for a shift. The night was calm, just routine paperwork and a few routine calls. Around midnight, he was sent to patrol the airport on the city's outskirts, a simple routine task, a presence check for the night's shift. Malik was walking down the terminal's course when he saw her, Millie, standing at a boarding gate, her back to him, loudly berating the flight staff. Her voice unmistakably shrill and frustrated as she demanded something about a first-class upgrade. The attendant looked stressed but maintained their professionalism, apologizing and trying to appease her as she hurled insults at them. Malik sighed, her public outburst seemed to be a pattern wherever she went. As he approached, a man in line turned to Malik with a pleading look, as if silently begging for intervention. And as if fate had aligned this moment, Millie turned around, and her gaze landed right on Malik. Her eyes widened, flickering with recognition and contempt, and she sneered openly, clearly seeing an opportunity for another confrontation. "Well, well, well," she said loudly, drawing attention from everyone around them. "If it isn't Officer Blake, following me around like a lost puppy." Her tone dripped with sarcasm, her voice laced with the familiar mocking hostility. Malik stayed calm, knowing full well that any response would only give her more fuel. He gave her a polite nod, choosing to ignore her and turning to speak with the flight attendants instead. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, making sure to keep his voice neutral. One of the attendants gave him a grateful nod, but before she could answer, Millie interrupted with a scoff. "Oh, please," she snapped. "You're probably just here to keep tabs on me, aren't you? What? Can't let me live my life in peace? Don't you have real criminals to chase?" The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably, some passengers murmuring, others clearly annoyed by her behavior. Malik kept his focus on the attendant, but Millie wouldn't let up. She took a step forward, almost challenging him, her voice echoing through the terminal. "People like you, always meddling, always watching. It's pathetic, really. Really," she continued, her voice rising, "you're nothing more than a glorified security guard, pretending to be something important." Malik felt the eyes of bystanders on him, watching and waiting to see how he'd react. He took a steadying breath, refusing to engage, but Millie took another step, invading his personal space. "I mean, look at you," she hissed. "All you'll ever be is a nobody in a uniform, a pawn, just another insignificant said in the machine." Her voice had reached a fever pitch, and that was enough for Malik. He raised his hand calmly, motioning her to take a step back, his voice steady and firm. "I'm asking you to keep your distance. If you continue this behavior, I will be forced to intervene." But she only laughed, the sound sharp and condescending. "Oh, really? You think you can threaten me?" She looked around, appealing to the crowd as if she had an audience on her side. "This man has been stalking me, harassing me. He's obsessed with me, and now he's trying to intimidate me in public." The accusations hung heavy in the air, but Malik knew there was no need to argue. Instead, he quietly spoke to the flight attendant, ensuring she understood that he was there for assistance. As he turned to leave, he noticed two security officers approaching, alerted by the commotion. He explained the situation to them, one nodded and began guiding Millie away, her protests and complaints echoing down the hall as she was led to a quiet area for questioning. Relieved the incident had ended without further escalation, Malik went back to his patrol, hoping this would be the last encounter with Millie. But as he made his way back through the terminal, a voice called his name over the intercom, requesting him to report to the security office. Confused, Malik made his way there, wondering if the matter with Millie had somehow spiraled further. When he arrived, he was surprised to see Millie sitting in a chair, clearly fuming, her hands cuffed in front of her. Her face was a mix of anger and frustration as she glared at him, but he didn't react. The officer in charge briefed Malik on the situation, explaining that he had detained Millie for causing a public disturbance and for making false accusations against him. As the officer continued, Millie, seated and unable to keep quiet, spat, "This is all your fault, Malik. You think you're untouchable, but I'll ruin you." The officer raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I suggest you calm down. Your behavior tonight has resulted in serious complaints, and your actions are under review. If you continue, this will only get worse for you." Millie's face paled as the gravity of the situation settled in. She opened her mouth to protest, but quickly closed it, realizing her threats had finally run out of power. Malik watched silently, a sense of vindication washing over him, though he remained outwardly calm. After all her harassment and attempts to undermine and insult him, karma had finally come around. In the following days, Malik learned that Millie's outburst had led to multiple complaints from bystanders who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. She'd face legal consequences and public scrutiny, and the very reputation she tried to damage was now her own to rebuild. Malik returned to his duties, relieved that her chapter in his life had come to a close, knowing that respect, professionalism, and patience had won the day in the end. If you liked this story, share your thoughts and observations in the comment section below, and make sure to like and subscribe for the next interesting and entertaining story ever. Also, in order to strengthen our community, I would like to know where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video. Have a nice day.